All right, so I have about 2 o'clock here, so we'll get started. Thank you guys once again for registering and coming today. I'm thrilled to present our speaker, Mark Harper, who will be discussing the origins of comic books. Mark Harper grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas. He got his bachelor's and master's degree in English and comparative literature at Texas Tech University. In 1991, he moved to Bloomington, Indiana to complete his PhD in film studies at Indiana University. Mark remained in Indiana and taught for IUPUI in the Heron School of Art and Design. He taught courses in film, literature, art history, writing, visual theory, and he taught a special course called The History of American Comic Books and Graphic Novels. Mark personally designed this original class, and Heron continued to offer it for an art history credit for 7 years. Now, Mark is the director of the film program at Heartland Community College in Normal, Illinois. And take it away, Mark.
All right, can everybody hear me? So first of all, thank you, Ryan, for that nice introduction. And I want to thank the guest here today for having an interest in comic book history. This is fantastic. And I hope that I give you a rewarding hour that's not just a slog through history, but something a little bit more kind of open and challenging. So let's take a look at this. So here's our itinerary. Like the title card says, we're going to be going all the way back to ancient times to be thinking about comic books, but we're going to kind of make these different stops along the way to basically look at how did we reach the current format of comic books. So just a lot of different stops, basically kind of going through history, looking how the medium has changed, but also how the medium has kind of always been what it is today. Now, I'm an educator, so I like things to be interactive, and I hope at the end of our session today you will not be shy because I want to get your input on this. So I'm taking you through history, but in my opinion, history is not the past. We are currently living out the tail end of history, and we're looking at a modern kind of art form, a modern literary medium. So my question to you folks is, when you read a graphic novel or a comic book, what makes that experience unique or different from reading an ordinary book? So as we go through this history, I want you to be thinking about any comic books or graphic novels you've ever read, what your interest is in them, what kind of pleasure do you get out of that reading experience? So you will see this question again before we are done today. Now, I want to start kind of with June of 1938, because what you see there is this comic book I'm holding in my hand, except this is not the original. If it was the original, I'd be wealthy and I'd be on a yacht in the Mediterranean Ocean right now. This is a commemorative edition. But in June of 1938, we get this comic book come out called Action Comics 1. And then 80 years later, they had a special commemorative edition of this comic done with guest editor Brian Michael Bendis. And just to kind of tell you how much things had changed in that 80-year period between 38 and 18, in August of 2014, an original edition of Action Comics 1 sold for $3.2 million. So that's how much that had appreciated over time. Now, we're going to look at Action Comics and think about Action Comics as this point where, how did we get here? How did we reach this particular point? Because when you look at any edition of a comic book, just like this one in my hand, it really hasn't changed since 1938. It's pretty much the same type of media format. We want to consider, how did we reach this point? All right, let's go back in history. So what we're looking at here is a vase, and specifically, we're looking at something that is an early version of comic books in a way. So I could give you the history of classical, ceramics and talk about that, but instead let's talk about the fact that this particular artist, Ezekias, I believe is his name, has carefully put in this image of Achilles and Ajax playing a board game. And it's amazing looking, but let's consider how this fits into what we understand to be comic books. For instance, when we look at this, we can see figures that are recognizable to the public because they recognized Achilles and Ajax from oral traditions and from songs. We recognize Ajax and Achilles on here because we've read the Iliad in high school or seen the movie with Brad Pitt. It's interesting too that Ezekias has decided to put in heroes into this medium and very carefully and symmetrically place them within this medium, because if you look at the way they appear there, they're perfectly balanced within this. It's almost like an early comic book panel because they fit so neatly into this. Now, if you look closely at what's happening there, they're playing a game, and basically the premise is they're taking a break from the battle to play a board game. And you can actually see the speech bubbles. Achilles is there on the left, Ajax is on the right, and Achilles happens to be winning the game. So we can hear them calling out the numbers of whatever this game is that they're playing. We can also look at the line work, and the line work also kind of tells us what's going on as well. Ajax, Achilles, the one on the left, his feet are propped up, but he's a little bit more relaxed. We look at Ajax's feet, and the line, that curve, kind of says he's tense. He's not winning this game right now. Now, this makes a fit subject matter for classical Greek ceramics and pottery because this is about a celebration of heroes, and this is an interest in hearing and seeing the stories of heroes in some sort of visual medium. So Ezekias knows his audience here, and he knows that they want to look at this particular image on this vase and sort of repeat the story of Ajax and Achilles and be thinking about the story of Ajax and Achilles. So it's a way to sort of commemorate this. But again, I want you to notice for the medium, it's so carefully placed here, Achilles' figure and Ajax's figure here in this perfect balanced way. Well, we're not done with ancient Greece. Let's go forward about 100 years. And here we have an artist's rendition of what the Temple of Zeus would have looked like and in Olympia. And I'd like to say a little bit more about this while we're talking about ancient Greece, because what you see on the upper row here of the temple are what are called Motopis. And a Motopy is this rectangular space placed between the triglyphs on a Doric frieze. So it's a band of images that runs across the top of the Greek temple. Now, if we look at the actual images here, these are kind of artist recreations of this. If you look at the recreation here, you've got basically the labors of Hercules created. Now, the temples of ancient Greece were interactive spaces. People went them to hear songs, to watch theatrical performances, to participate in dance festivities, but also to look and think about the storytelling. So I'm looking at these Motopis and I'm thinking this is an early version of comic books because we're still looking at something that is celebrating the hero, and it's so neatly and logically fit within this space, and it's sequential. So early Greek citizens would have walked around a temple like this and looked at these images and talked about them and basically kind of celebrated these through the storytelling. Now let's look at one up close. So it's repeating different stories from the labors of Hercules. And I won't tell you the entire story here, except that the goddess Athena is at this particular moment giving Hercules an assist by holding up the sky there. And what you have on the right is Atlas, who has gathered the golden apples as Hesperides for Hercules and is now giving them back. So Athena is giving Hercules an assist there to hold up the sky so he can claim the apples from Atlas, and then Atlas can resume his duties of holding up the sky. Now, what I like about this is, if this is a Motopy, if this is something that the Greek citizens would have looked at from down below and kind of appreciated, they're looking at this perfect logical sculpture that's been put into place here so they can see idealized form, this idealized form of Hercules, idealized form of Atlas, even Athena. These tectonic lines that kind of diagram her face are all idealized. So it's a celebration of logic and order and democracy. And again, something interactive, something that people would have not just looked at, but also kind of read sequentially as they moved around it. Now, I bring up these two slides because we're going to do this quick jump through history just to kind of think about the fact that we've been kind of appreciating and reading and celebrating sequential art narratives, what now we call graphic novels and comic books, for a long, long time now. But let's jump forward in history to the Bayou Tapestry. I like this one especially because it is a one-of-a-kind work of art. It was probably based on existing illustrations from illuminated manuscripts. And it was probably, the origins of this are kind of debatable. The origins of this are probably commissioned by the Bishop Odo, the half-brother of William the Conqueror. And this was probably meant to celebrate the newly built cathedral in Bayeux, France. Now, what this tapestry is a sequential narrative. So let's look at the details of it. So it tells the story of the Norman conquest, and it is believed that the tapestry was sewn not long after the events took place. So it's meant to kind of commemorate the Norman conquest in the late 1000s. It's not technically a tapestry because it's just embroidery on linen. But when you think about the length, we're talking about a very, very long comic book because this is quite long, 224 feet, 20 inches high, and it's got these little friezes, these bands, three inches across or 3 inches high above and below. And it stretches on and stretches on and stretches on. So let's talk about why would we call this an early form of comic book? It certainly is one of a kind. It was kind of an experiment, I suppose, because we don't have a whole lot of examples of this in life, but let's look at something up close here. First of all, it's telling a story, and it's giving us the cause and effect story of the Norman conquest, and it's telling it in chronological order. And if we look at the story as it takes place, it's action driven. We're following the events as they unfold in a very strong cause and effect way. And the emphasis is on gesture and confrontation and decisions and strategies. Also, the expressions on the faces, which I just love, they're abbreviated. So we get this sort of straightforward, concise depiction of facial expression, just like when you look at comic strips in the morning or online or daily newspaper, we're just kind of getting this sort of flat emoji-like expression on the faces that kind of give you a sense of who these people are. It's legible though, it reads left to right, it's sequential. And when you follow this, you're basically looking at 58 individual scenes from the Norman conquest, and you're following 626 individual characters. We get horses. It's goal-driven narrative. In other words, when you read through the Bayeux Tapestry, you're going for this victory moment for William the Conqueror. There's realism to the subject matter too. For instance, one of the key moments of this particular historic event was King Harold II dying on the battlefield with an arrow, going right through his eye and killing him. So that's featured in the tapestry as well. We also get realistic elements such as decapitated soldiers and weaponry and horses and boat design and armor, figures in battle poses, etc. But we get these fantastic elements too. You can see in these friezes above and below griffins and centaurs and figures from Aesop's fables. So it's very fanciful how it's been put together, and it's not just, serving this purpose of telling the story. There's kind of a celebration going on here too, and there's a nice entertaining storytelling quality to this particular tapestry. So I like looking at this and at the ancient Greeks and thinking to myself about how did we reach this modern medium? How did we come to appreciate and enjoy, comic books and graphic novels as something that is just an ordinary part of our daily existence. But the Bayeux Tapestry is one of a kind. We're not going to see anything more like this for a while. Let's jump though to Europe in the 1400s. And this is a real transition point because now we have movable type printing beginning in Germany in the 1450s. So this is going to change everything. Now, signs and signage and different types of printing were around for centuries before this. It's just the appearance of movable type makes things like broadsheets or broadsides, mass production of information. It makes these things more accessible. And if you can see from this particular broadsheet or broadside, it's a sensational kind of advertising. In other words, it really draws you in. It's an early form of media that it's not, something fancy like an illuminated manuscript. It's got artwork to it, but also it's meant to be kind of figured out right away. And we get elements of speech bubbles and captions kind of dotted here and there within this, kind of tell us what story we're being told. Now let's go back to art. Let's go back to art for a second. And William Hogarth is somebody who is frequently considered to be the father of comic books in the modern day. And at this point, I'd like you to be thinking about the dollar sign, because up until now, when we think about ancient Greek art and we think about the Bayou Tapestry, yes, these things cost money, but it wasn't necessarily something that was commercial. Here with William Hogarth, we begin to see some commercial origins of comic book art, and we begin to see somebody who's begun to think about, how can I capitalize on sequential art? And I want to tell you a few things about Hogarth before we look at some of his artwork. He had a very strong aptitude for engraving and sketching and plate design. He painted as well, well-known artist, but he loved thinking about printing and playing with print, and especially did some plate design for booksellers. And he often took a very satirical approach to his subject matter. So Hogarth is paying attention to what kinds of images appear in mass media and on broadsheets, as well as what kind of images appear in more sophisticated paintings and portraiture. And Hogarth is trying to go for something in between there. Now, he is very much interested in making some money, though, because like any artist, he's trying to think, okay, if I can't make it within the more sophisticated, high-end world of art, and I don't want to become just somebody that works for a newspaper or a sign maker, what kind of middle ground can I find here? So in 1731, he begins the first in what he calls a series of moral works. And these are collections of panels intended to be read as sequential art. So he wants to create something that's sold as a set. And if he's titling moral works, that means that there's some sort of lesson, some sort of theme to follow, some sort of takeaway that he wants people to get after they follow along with these printings or paintings that he's done. And he means for these things to be sold as a set. So he's doing a series of 6 paintings or 7 paintings. And he says, no, you're not going to buy them individually. I want the whole set to be sold. So he's thinking about, how can I maximize the dollar here, or the pound? We're going to look at what's called a harlot's progress. So the title alone should tell you that he's already kind of dealing in something that is sensational. It's going to be something that kind of draws our attention to subject matter that perhaps would not show up in a sophisticated portrait or painting, but also something that maybe images might tell us a better story than maybe something we'd read about in the newspaper. So we're going to look at the 6 panels that make up a harlot's progress, and we're going to look at these samples as examples of something that maybe become comic books in the centuries to follow. So it's a series of etchings and engravings. And originally there were some paintings that existed of all 6 of these, but these paintings are lost. And so you can see by the size, these are, definitely something that can hang on the wall. And he means for these to be hung on the wall in sequence. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of quickly go through the whole harlot's progress with you, just so you can kind of see the sequence here. And then we're going to go back to one of the panels and talk about, why would we call this an early version of comic book? So it tells a story. And we have the character here that Hogarth called Moll Hackabout. So she's a girl from the country, and she's arrived at the big city, and she's hoping to find work maybe as a domestic servant or a seamstress, but already she's falling into the wrong hands. So she's meeting this woman named Mother Needham. And I want to point out that this character, Mother Needham, was actually a person that people knew in the streets of London. So a procurer of women to work in brothels or as prostitutes. So this is a caricature of a known person. And we can see right away that Mother Needham does not have Moll Hackabout's best interest at heart. And we can see she's already besetting upon her. And you can see a prospective client in the background, some icky guy kind of watching them. And we can also see other women who have come from the country who are also going to fall in bad times. So Hogarth is engaging in all kinds of social commentary right away with this type of comic. And this is something I want to mention later on, is something that persists in comic books, is this sort of low-level element of realism and social commentary that occurs. And there's other details here. For instance, the horse is nudging this stack of pots, and they're tipping over. So we get this sense of gravity, and perhaps we're going to watch the downfall of Moll Hackabout. So we're going to go through her history here. By this point, Moll Hackabout has become the mistress of a wealthy person, but she's not being very smart about this. Basically, her wealthy benefactor has shown up in her apartment where she's being kept at a bad time. Because what you see back here is the maid helping another lover of Moll Hackabout's sneak out, so that the benefactor does not see what's going on here. So Moll is basically kicking over the table here to create a diversion. What we can tell from the face of her benefactor and from her servant there from the West Indies, that perhaps she's not going to get away with this. She's not being very smart about her position here. Panel 3. Moll has now become not a mistress of a wealthy person, but something that's a little bit more like a common prostitute working out of a room in a hotel or an inn or something like that. And she's not doing very well here either, because you see tankards of beer lying on the floor. You see kind of a messy room. There's evidence, you can't really see it that well in this particular printing of it, but there's evidence here that perhaps she's beginning to suffer from syphilis. So Hogarth is trying to give us some details here of what's going on. And we see people showing up here in the background to arrest Moll. Okay, so at this particular point, Moll Hackabout is in Broadwell Prison, where other women of ill repute have been arrested and are being put to work beating hemp. Hemp is sometimes used to create hangman's nooses. And so Moll's clothes are a subject of ridicule for some of the women who've been working in Broadwell Prison for a while. And again, we're watching in just 4 panels this downfall of Moll Hackabout. And Hogarth means for us to be looking at these panels side by side. Okay, panel 5. Moll is now out of prison and she's back in this sort of garret apartment, and things have become worse. She's wrapped up in these sweating blankets, which means that she's now beginning to suffer badly from some sort of venereal disease. And she now has a child who's playing too close to the fire. Meanwhile, these 2 fellows here, who I believe were known members of the medical society at the time, but who Hogarth considered to be just quacks. So Hogarth is kind of giving us caricatures of known people here, and they're arguing over what should we do, to save the life of this prostitute. But neither one of them are really attending to her at all. And meanwhile, probably a landlady is going through her belongings thinking, what can I sell? Because she's clearly not going to pay her rent. And then finally we get to the last panel here. And so now we don't actually see Moll Hackabout, we actually see the coffin here. And we see a number of people here. Some of them are paid mourners, some of them are fellow prostitutes who are still plying their trade. Many of these people don't look at all to be aware of what's happened to this woman. So in other words, Hogarth is giving us a very downbeat sort of story for our 6th panel to kind of think about, this is my moral work, this is a harlot's progress, which is no progress at all. Now, what's interesting about this, and that's the last panel, I want to go back to the previous panel here and think about, why would we call this a comic book? How does this work as a comic book? Well, let's think first of all the fact that we have action and movement within the panel. So we've got Moll in this moment of kicking over the table in this comic kind of moment, and you can see the teacups and china falling off the coffee table there, and it's an action moment. And she's also being kind of coy here by kind of smiling at her benefactor and kind of snapping her fingers, just kind of in a relaxed way, hoping to divert his attention. We also see little traces here, like there's a comedy and tragedy mask here on the dressing table that kind of indicate the fact that she's kind of pretending and faking things. But we also see elements of caricature, and some of these are racial caricature. The benefactor to the 1700s would have been recognizably Jewish to people looking at Hogarth's paintings. And so Hogarth's kind of playing around with racial stereotyping with the imaging here. And this is, again, something that's going to persist within the world of comic strips, this ability to create stereotypes and caricatures through line drawings. The other thing I want to point out about this, and the reason why we look at this, is to consider the fact that this particular panel gets meaning because of the sequence. This panel only makes sense because we saw this panel before. and this panel afterwards. And we get this repetition here. For instance, we were able to look at the face of the main character here and still see the depiction that Hogarth wants us to see in repetition of Mall Hackabout's face. There's also a sense of time, too. There's a sense of, okay, where are we now in this particular chapter? Meanwhile, something else that's going on here is Hogarth is playing with the science of comic books, too. And this is where Hogarth ties in with the name of our comic book fest, Will Eisner. Will Eisner, this comic book creator and comic book theorist, said, you create comic books by omission and addition. In other words, you create panels that tell that best moment of the story, and that leaves the reader the ability to imagine what happened in between those panels. So this medium is playing with our ability to kind of decide for ourselves what happened between Mall's stay in Bridewell Prison and Mall's illness. What happened in between that? And we're able to kind of fill in the blanks with these illustrations to keep us moving forward. So here we are in Europe, England of the 1700s. We're going to move forward to the 1800s now, to what is considered to be the first comic book that is in book form. So the person we see here is Rudolf Topfer, and he was the son of a painter, and he worked mostly as a teacher, and he established a boarding school for boys. And I want to stress the fact that as the headmaster of a boarding school for boys in Switzerland, he's somebody who would have been, aware of kids' humor. He would have enjoyed kids. He would have liked their jokes, their antics. And when you look at his comic book, The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, you're looking at something that definitely has appeal to kids and has this sort of childish kind of draw to it. Now, he created this book, and starting in the late 1820s, and it was published in America in the early 1840s. It was published in different languages. It was not a financial success, unfortunately. Now, Topfer was not a novice about comic book art. When we look at the pages, some of the pages from The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, you'll see this is a person that has thought a great deal about how comic books work. But he's a forerunner because he doesn't really have anybody around other than people like Hogarth and some other examples for him to plot out these stories. So he's really seen as somebody who is really breaking the ice, breaking new ground here on comic book art. And we have only to look at the pages of this to kind of see elements of this. So we get this story, and just like we had with the Harlot's Progress, we get these recognizable characters showing up in the individual pages of Obadiah Oldbuck. We're also seeing individual panels that are interdependent with each other, so we can follow the story and basically look at the panels as images of cause and effect. We're also looking at the panels in the sense that it's breaking the fourth wall. We're getting a world of a story, and we're getting to peek into that particular world window by window by window. So he's using the comic book as a kind of window form. Something else we're seeing here is a lot of doodly kind of sketchy drawings. Now this too is important. We look at a Harlot's Progress, and Hogarth is creating much more of a finished image. When we look at the details in a Harlot's Progress, these are finished paintings, finished drawings. In The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, we're getting drawings that are still slightly sketchy. Now, I think this is genius because Topfer knows that if you give people just a sketch of something, their brain finishes the picture and completes the picture. And it also keeps you moving forward because there's a desire there. I want to get to the end of this. I want to see where the picture gets formed all the way. I want to see what happens to this character. So he knows, give the reader just enough of an image to get them moving forward to the next image. Don't give them something that they're going to linger over for a long, long period of time. Now there's other science going on here too, and it's amazing what he does here. Now you can see from the images on the left there that although this is kind of childish humor and we get this sort of colorful comic character of Obadiah Oldbuck with a funny name, there's also a little bit of an adult humor to this. There's a morbid sense of this too. Obadiah Oldbuck becomes suicidal at different points. He suffers different cartoon-like disasters. I think at one point in the story he gets buried alive. So there's a little bit of a macabre humor to this, and that's what makes me think. I think that Topfer definitely knew the humor of little boys because he just definitely liked this idea of violence. So we're seeing this in the pages of this comic book, an emphasis on action. But something else that's genius here is Topfer's using what's called metonymy. And that's where you give in an image a detail of something that suggests a bigger picture, where you can't see the whole picture here, but you get just enough of a detail to get an idea of something that's happening outside of the frame there. And that too is something that hooks into our brain and keeps us reading and moving forward as we're reading through the comic book. So the Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, like the Bayou Tapestry, is a one-of-a-kind kind of thing. I mean, I have to hand it to Top for somebody that says, I want to put all of this down into one book and see if the public likes it. The differences between the Bayou Tapestry and Obadiah Oldbuck is that Topfer is trying to break into publishing now. He's trying to break into print with this particular book. And even though it financially does not work, it's an example of somebody that says, what if we put this together in some sort of book form that people could read just like any other novel and would keep on the bookshelf right next to a copy of Wuthering Heights or Tale of Two Cities? What if we created a book just like this? Well, now we're moving forward into the modern form because in between the mid 1800s and the late 1800s, we're seeing more and more magazines come out that have a lot of visual caricatures, a lot of visual illustrations, things that are much more comic, something a little bit more akin to what we see now. There's a lot more political cartoons showing up in these magazines like Puck and The Judge. And these are selling points. People want to buy these magazines because they want to laugh at these images. They want to see the caricatures and enjoy the humor of these caricatures. Now, something else is happening too, because there's a rise of this type of visual representation in the late 1800s, and there's more of a market for this too. People buying these magazines just so they can keep up with this. Now, I like to relate this a little bit more to commerce at this point, because if you have more and more people with disposable income and you have the Industrial Revolution making all kinds of goods and services readily available to the public, you need more advertising to hook people into this. And I like bringing up the Quaker Oats guy because we get this very familiar image now to our eyes, the Quaker Oats guy that appears on the box of oatmeal. And we can look at that image and we can see a kind of caricature of a certain personality or somebody that seems to represent something, you know, purity and wholeness and wholesomeness there. And it's identifiable. You're going to see this every morning when you eat breakfast, or almost every morning when you eat breakfast. When you go to the grocery store, you're going to look for that guy. So it's identifiable. It's somebody you can recognize and see and say, hey, I like that guy. I want that. I need that. So more and more image-oriented type of mass media and advertising is playing with these identity politics and bringing people in to relating more to the visuals. So here's our turning point, the yellow kid. Now, when I teach comic book history, I sometimes assign students this essay of prove that the yellow kid thesis is correct or prove that the yellow kid thesis is incorrect. And argue it either way. Just write me a really good essay that argues it either way. A lot of people look at the yellow kid and they say, this really is where modern comic books begin. Now, I want to kind of go through the history of this a little bit just so we can kind of think about what did the yellow kid have that Obadiah Oldbuck and Mal Hackabout and the other examples don't have? What makes a difference here with this particular kid? And then we're going to look at a few yellow kid comics just to kind of see exactly how does this play with the same type of dynamics that we're used to getting when we read comic books. So here's our creator, Richard F. Outcault. And after he did The Yellow Kid, he went on to do several other comics. Originally, he had just kind of worked and done different work drawing comics. And you have to remember, comics existed before this. We've got examples of that in Puck and The Judge. You just don't have a regular character, a regular single character appearing in these comics all the time. So Outcault is working for the Sunday World newspaper by Joseph Pulitzer, and he is doing a like single panel comic called Hogan's Alley, and we'll look at an example of that here in a second. And it does pretty well. So it's a single panel comic, just like something like the Family Circus or something Dennis the Menace, something where it's just one image for you to look at each day and get a laugh over. But what's also happening in the 1890s is we're moving into color printing. So in 1893, Pulitzer installed a 4-color rotary press. And that changed the medium of comics into something that were much more eye-catching, something that would draw the audience to it. And especially on Sundays, you think about looking forward to the Sunday comics, that stretches all the way back to the 1890s, because Pulitzer also knew this is going to be a good selling point. If we have a family that likes to get the Sunday newspaper, well, if we wrap that Sunday newspaper in color comics, that means when the family gets home, you know, when the dad gets home with the comics, there's something in there for everybody. So it's a big selling point, and newspapers are on the rise now. In 1900, there were 915 American cities that had daily newspapers, and 61% of those American cities had competing editions. In other words, more than one newspaper in that town. Now, what sets him apart is the fact that he created this character, the Yellow Kid, and once he created that character, the Yellow Kid, also known as Mickey Dugan, and began featuring the Yellow Kid in the Hogan's Alley comic, suddenly everybody wanted that comic because we have this recognizable kid, the Yellow Kid. And Outcalt becomes a desired artist. So William Randolph Hearst basically hires or steals Outcalt away from Pulitzer and hires him to work for his newspaper. Well, the funny thing is, even though Outcalt began working for Hearst, back at the Sunday World, people still use the Yellow Kid art without anybody's permission because there's no copyright for it. So this kind of sets a precedent, though, because Outcalt basically is forced to write to the Library of Congress and say, hey, this is my creation. I created this little character, the Yellow Kid, and I need the copyright on this because I'm getting taken to the cleaners here by the people copying my work here. But everybody loves the Yellow Kid. They're crazy about this character. Now, from a business angle, this changes everything. And this is a slide I used to use in my comic book history class. And I want to be aware of the time here, you know, so I don't kind of get too bogged down in the history and can move forward in the 20th century. I think the difference that Outcalt is doing here is he's working as an artisan and not as an assembly line worker. If he was an assembly line worker working for a newspaper doing a daily comic strip without the Yellow Kid, it really doesn't matter who's doing it. But once he creates a character like the Yellow Kid and claims ownership of the Yellow Kid, he can decide anything he wants to happen to the Yellow Kid, especially if he's got the copyright on it. So he can give that character a sense of depth. Also, he can maintain full creative control over the Yellow Kid and make sure that nobody else copies this and does anything else with it. And if it's a certain point in time, he decides, okay, I want to shut this down. I want to move on and do a different comic strip, not the Yellow Kid, then he's my character to control. So Outcalt's kind of setting himself up as somebody who has artistic freedom over his own product. And if you're in the mass media, you're going to hire Outcalt to do this work for you. So from a business angle, we're seeing the beginnings of the whole comic book industry at this point, the idea of authorship. Now, something else we're seeing is what's called synergy, and that's when you have all kinds of other products being released with the same image. So the Yellow Kid was so popular that over the next 20 years, you're getting all kinds of different products being made using the Yellow Kid image because people just like this character. They like this figure. They're, you know, brings amusement to their life. Now, Outcalt's not making money off of this because he discovered too late that people are copying his work. So I like to include this slide as well. This was a replica, a facsimile of the letter he wrote to the Library of Congress that basically said, this is my work. I need to claim ownership of the Yellow Kid, Mickey Dugan, because I did this. And he even drew the picture of the Yellow Kid there in the copyright. So prior to this, nobody had to do this before in order to claim this kind of commercial ownership. But since Outcalt is now having to do this, from a business standpoint, we really are getting the beginnings of an industry. Now, I want to share with you a little bit about how this actually works and how Outcalt is playing with comic book dynamics and comic book aesthetics. This is a typical image from Hogan's Alley. I think at this point it's called Casey's Alley when Colt was drawing this. And if you look at this particular comic, it is a single panel, but there's so much going on here for anybody to kind of pick up and enjoy. First of all, no matter where you look in the frame, you're getting all kinds of story information, and you're getting kids doing all kinds of crazy things. But there's a surreal level of violence to this, something that's just over the top. And this kid's getting a brick thrown in his face. There's some sort of strange spinning going on here in the background. There's actually blood running on the pavement there. We got kids over here just basically flying around. Something else we're seeing here, though, is we're getting the dubious presence of the law. Right here in this particular image, we're getting the figure of the policeman who is not necessarily doing anything to stop this violence. The policeman simply going on his route, doing his rounds, and not really paying attention to the fact that these antics are happening. And then we get a punchline, too. The great football match down in Casey's Alley. And if you hunt throughout the image, you actually see the punchline to this. The punchline's right here. The football's lying right there on the ground with cobwebs growing on it. So there's your joke. Now, something else that Outcall's playing with here is social divisions and social changes, because he's showing in his comic strip an image of something that would have been familiar to city dwellers of all kinds of classes and from all kinds of neighborhoods and from all different points of status. There's childish antics, kids' humor going on here, but also there's a reality to this too, because some of the readers of this comic would have been walking right through neighborhoods just like this, or living in neighborhoods just like this, and would have been aware of the reality of this. So he's taking something as a social reality and making humor out of it. And in that way, hoping to appeal to people of different classes with this kind of humor. So let's look at how the yellow kid himself fits into this. What Outcall does here is he takes the same kind of antics and he places at the very front of the antics this kid, this very strange looking kid wearing a nightshirt on backwards with these jug ears and this strange head, breaking the fourth wall and looking directly out at the reader and addressing the reader. And sometimes gesturing back over his shoulder, basically saying, can you believe this craziness going on behind me here? So bringing the reader into the joke and letting the reader kind of look at the joke and consider the joke. For instance, the one on the left is called What They Did to the Dog Catcher in Hogan's Alley. So it's going nuts because the kids in Hogan's Alley don't want the dog catcher there to take away all their stray dogs. They like the stray dogs. They're actually catching the dog catcher's, kennel on fire. They're releasing the dogs. They're beating the dog catcher up. They're chasing away other people. It's just craziness going on. So typically the Hogan's Alley comic would be some sort of event, but there'd just be a lot of visual information in there for you to sort of look through and piece over. A child could maybe spend, a long time looking through these. And, this is kind of how kids begin to break the ice with reading sometimes too. I can remember going to my dad sometimes and asking him, what's going on in this comic strip? Can you explain to me what the joke is for this? And he explained to me, this is how this is working, or this is what the story is going on here. So kids pick up on this. Let's think for a second, though, about the yellow kid, Mickey Dugan himself. He's definitely a character. He's breaking the ice here, and he's looking directly out at us, and he gives us the appearance of this strange, almost freakish kind of child, almost like maybe, somebody who would be an imbecile or somebody who would not be the smartest person in the room. But instead, Mickey Dugan is usually the smartest person in the room. He's the one that is catching our attention and saying, folks, can you believe how crazy things are back over my shoulder here? Get a load of this. And sometimes printed on Mickey Dugan's shirt would be a message that we'd read. And the message would be some sort of punchline or some sort of wisecracker kind of statement that Dugan's making for us to get the punchline of whatever the comic book joke is. Let's consider, though, the social reality of this. Because you have families from all different walks of life who may want newspapers, and it's an affordable form of entertainment. You're also having families different reading levels going on in the house. You have a lot of immigrant families on the rise in the early 1900s, different people with different levels of acquisition of the English language. So comic books are becoming, or comic art is becoming a way to sort of bring people into this and help people acclimate to the social realities of the world, whatever those social realities of the world happen to be. And it's mass media, it's affordable. It's easy to get your hands on a comic book. Now here's the social reality of this, and these are photographs taken by a guy named Jacob Reese, who went into some of the slum areas of New York City and took these photographs. And I love the one there on the left because that could be Mickey Dugan right there. You have a child who is not wearing, infant's clothing or anything else like that because that would cost too much. Instead, you're going to probably put the kid in a diaper if you can afford a diaper, and take a man's shirt and put the man's shirt on the kid backwards. So that's going to be the kid's clothing, and you'd shave the kid's head because that's a way to stop lice. So there's a strong social reality to the character of Mickey Dugan. The strange thing about Mickey Dugan, the yellow kid, is it's hard to tell, is he Irish? Is he Chinese? What is he? There's sort of this ethnic mix blended into this particular character. And again, this sort of amalgamation is something that people find appealing because he's identifiable from so many different angles here. And yet people kind of know in their hearts, this is kind of bringing up a social reality that we're aware of. Now, I'm going to stay aware of the time here because I want to keep moving through our history. But now we've got the origins of the commercial beginnings of comic books. And over the next 20 to 30 years, characters just like Mickey Dugan begin showing up in comics, in comic book pages. People begin reading more and more and following more and more of these characters in the daily comic strips. Other artists, just like Outcalt, have discovered if I create a character that people are going to follow, maybe a larger than life character that people are going to follow, then I, like Outcalt, can be hired by somebody like Pulitzer or Hearst and make some money doing this. So as an art form, as a commercial art form, this begins to rise throughout the 19 teens on into the 1920s as a popular form. We have to consider, how does this become a comic book though? Where does it flip over into that? Well, I want to take a brief segue and talk about the effect of World War I on reading habits and reading tastes. And I want to think about what happened to attitudes, especially towards literature and towards popular reading material after World War I, because we have so many different crises affecting citizens all the way through World War II that are going to be kind of the bedrock, the foundation for what becomes the modern comic book. I also want to say something I meant to say at the beginning of the lecture. I tend to over-prepare for these things, so if at a certain point I start clicking through some slides real quickly, it's so I can get through our lecture here and give us time to talk. So let's take a look at this. After World War I, we get a lot of disillusionment occurring. You have men returning from World War I with a completely different attitude towards government, completely different attitude towards national status. It feels more like the individual against the world. All kinds of social changes have impacted the entire human species on a global level because World War I, being this machine-driven kind of military conflict, brought realities that people before World War I were just not prepared to accept. But after World War I, they're dealing with this, and class divisions are forming right and left. Meanwhile, you have other social changes occurring in the United States. For instance, you have Prohibition, which lasts from 1920 to 1933. Instead of maybe bettering society by eliminating alcohol, it actually makes things worse by creating a rise in organized crime. At the same time that you have this, you have a rise in entertainments too, because people are looking for some sort of easy diversion from these realities, something where you get a viewpoint that's going to kind of fit this new attitude, this new sense of alienation, and also something that's going to fit the economic struggle of people to survive in the city. So American hard-boiled crime fiction is on the rise. And I like putting these titles here because some of the titles we think of as, oh yeah, I've heard of that. I know it's a famous crime novel. Some of the novels we look at, we don't really think of them as being crime novels. But when you go back to the story, you think, well, in a way they are. The Great Gatsby, for instance, is of a figure who comes straight out of World War One in this disillusioned state, who's hoping somehow to capture some of the romance that existed before World War One, and who has some sort of sinister ties to the underworld, and who dies floating, face down in his own swimming pool. So this crime fiction that occurs and becomes so popular for the next 20 years gives people more of a taste of this hard-boiled kind of attitude. But what people like to read are pulp fiction in the magazines. They like to read these easy stories, easy to pick up, easy to put down. The key selling point for making pulp fiction is it's made on very, very inexpensive paper. It costs very little to buy a pulp magazine. These stories often have identifiable characters repeating from story to story to story. The stories are usually over the top. They deal with occult spiritualism, scientific experimentation, crime syndicates, the jungle, outer space. A lot of writers, such as Ray Bradbury, get their start working in the pulp magazines. And this is becoming incredibly popular for people trying to survive in the city. It's affordable, it's escapist. But the best part is these identifiable characters that occur from issue to issue. It's serialized. And we can look at this particular cover, for instance, and we can see the sensational quality of this. And the cover itself becomes a big key selling point because you can follow these characters from issue to issue and see what they do. They operate outside of the law. Bad guys lose, good guys win. And the hero usually disappears back into the underworld or back into his hiding place until the need for justice comes out once more. So if this is what people are reading, and if this is what literary taste is becoming, there's going to be a lot of cross-pollination between the types of characters that you see in the daily comic strips and the types of characters that you see in the pulp magazines. And some of the people writing for some of these publications are going to go on and write for other publications and go back and forth, back and forth. Meanwhile, the Great Depression hits, and suddenly publishers and anybody trying to make a living off of reading material is having to scramble. So for the last part of this, we're going to go through a quick timeline of what happens that brings about Action Comics 1. So this is kind of interesting in terms of basically how do people try to survive with a publication and end up coming out ahead. So 1929, Dell Publishing, who's been making a lot of pulp magazines, start doing reprints of newspaper comics. So this is stuff that's already been released in the newspapers, and they're releasing this in a tabloid format, so a much larger size than the comic book size that we're used to now. And for 10 cents, you can basically, they buy one issue, and this ran for 36 issues. So they're trying some way of making some money off of this and keeping people reading throughout this time. And it's interesting that they charged us 10 cents for this because for a long, long time, the price did not change. 10 cents is a very affordable price for anybody. So it looked like this. Big tabloid format. So 1933, things are getting harder. By 1933, there have been 4 different cycles of bank runs in the United States, 4 different cycles of banks just completely going under. And people basically telling Hoover, we no longer want you as president, we need FDR to save us. So by 1933, the unemployment level in the United States had risen into the 20%, and people are desperate. So publishers Wildenberg and Gulf Oil combined forces. And Wildenberg basically produces a weekly tabloid comic with all original material. So no reprints now, all original material. This is going to be a giveaway. In other words, if you fill up your gas tank at Gulf Oil, they'll give you a free comic to go along with that. And I'm just old enough to remember when gas stations had a little bit more going on for them with these kind of giveaways and things that you could just kind of get for free. So it still is this sort of tabloid size, so it's larger, and that makes printing this easier. And the giveaway status means that there's no real loss to it either. So it's showing that the publishing is flexible in terms of what they can do to try to make some money. And it looked like this. So you can see comic books kind of beginning to form into what we now consider to be this contemporary format. All right, something else is happening in 1933. We get Harry Wildenberg now working with a fellow named Max Gaines, and they're working with Procter & Gamble. They're going to try to bring a little bit more advertising into the comic book product. And they create this standard size now, the 7.5 inch by 10.5 inch comic book that has some original material and some previously published material. And again, they're using this as a giveaway. And the size fits. People like this size much better. And this is going to be the first of 3 attempts to get this standard comic book for sale on newsstands, places where people buy newspapers and magazines much more readily. So they're going to try to make a profit off of this. I'm going to see if this is going to work. So 1934, Famous Funnies comes out. And this is the first one that turns a profit on the newsstands. Finally, we get something in the contemporary size of comic books turning a profit. So people look at this and thinking maybe it can be done. Maybe this can happen. This is an issue of Famous Funnies. It includes other things like games and puzzles and magic tricks and things like that in advertising, but it actually turns a profit. So that's going to get more publishers, people who've been working in the pulp magazines, to be a little bit more interested in working in something that's comics. Okay, this I'm going to skip over just so we can kind of talk about what happens now. So this very flamboyant figure, Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, who is a veteran of World War I and who's been a jack of all trades. He's somebody who's worked in the pulp magazines. He's somebody who has done some drawing here, done some publishing there, tried his hand at just kind of writing more literary short stories. He's had a kind of very checkered career since World War I, but he sees that Famous Funnies is turning a profit. So Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson decides, I want to try to publish my own comic that has original material in it. Now, what's funny about this is original material in comic books was just at this point seen as filler. People are buying comic books to basically get reprints of what's in the newspaper. In other words, you can buy a comic book that lets you follow all of your favorite characters instead of just buying a newspaper every single day. And it's bound together in one little book there. And if there's original material in it, then it's like, oh yeah, that. I don't care about that. I want Little Orphan Annie, or I want Dick Tracy, somebody I'm used to seeing here. But Wheeler Nicholson thinks, I want to put more original material into the comic books. And I want that to be more of a selling point. Unfortunately, he's always running short of money, constantly running short of money. And he's having to lean on his distributors, people that, sell his magazines and comic books for him. And he's having to borrow this money from this person to pay this money for this person. It's not going well for him. And he never was a very savvy businessman about this. But he's making this one comic book work called Detective Comics. And briefly, I want you to look at the initials D and C here, because you can see where this is going. He's thinking, maybe I can make this work. Publishing nothing but original material. Well, this is a heartbreaking part of the story, but it's a true story that kind of goes along with the story of Action Comics. And that is when Wheeler Nicholson hired the talents of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. So these are 2 young men from Cleveland, Ohio, and they've been working on different comics, creating original material for Wheeler Nicholson to put into his comics. And they come up with this character called Superman. And originally their idea was, we want to have Superman be somebody who maybe the daily newspaper strips might pick up on, because we'd like to make Superman something that we can maintain some sort of artistic control over. So we can get the money from Superman by being the owners of this in the daily comic strips. But they're working for Wheeler Nicholson. And they're creating original story material for Wheeler Nicholson. And as we get closer and closer to June of 1938, this issue is planning on coming out at this point. Well, meanwhile, Wheeler Nicholson owes a lot of money to a lot of people. And the sad thing is he's about to go under because they're going to basically claim ownership of this and sue him in court and say, we're going to take your money. We want to take your business because you owe us way too much money. Well, that unfortunately is what's happened. So Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster are now working for two other people who now own the company. And because they were dependent upon Wheeler Nicholson, they now are finding we don't own Superman at all. So the sad part about this is when Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz basically force the major into bankruptcy and take complete control over Detective Comics and DC Comics, they also take control over Superman and the work of Siegel and Joe Shuster. However, it does result in Action Comics 1. So we get that. We at least get that. That's how we finally get this particular issue that comes out. Now, I do like to say this because this is a sad part of the story. If you ask the question, how much money did Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster get out of the deal for Superman, for creating Superman? Only $130 total to share. And that's the sad part about this story. They wanted to repeat the model that Outcalt had set, where you had some sort of ownership over your own artistic creation, but it didn't work. Didn't work. They managed to somehow get gypped out of that. But character lives on in Action Comics 1. So Action Comics 1 comes out in June of 1938. It's a huge success. Let me just kind of flip through it here real quickly as we kind of close down our history lesson. You get the character of Superman appearing. We get his childhood, we get his birth. We're also seeing Superman as a figure who is a problem solver, and he's a tough guy. And his alter ego, Clark Kent, is kind of a wuss. Superman's more of a He-Man, and he's a little bit more of a reformer. He's basically taking, this vigilante kind of approach to things and solving problems that the cops and the civic leaders can't solve. And he's fighting crime. And lots of people who've been following such characters in the pulp magazines are now discovering, you know what, I'd rather read about these characters in comic strips because it's so much more gratifying to look at a crime fighter or somebody interested in social justice in the pages of sequential art like this and see them go about solving the problem. Something else they like about this is the fact that the image that appeared on the cover of the comic is something they can find inside the pages of the comic right there. So when you bought the comic and you saw this image on the outside of the cover of the comic, you thought, I want to buy that because I want to see how did we get to that particular panel in the story. And I want to follow the story and have suspense and anticipation and then get that gratifying moment where I watch whoever that guy is basically taking the problems of the city in their own hands and fixing them right away. So it's interesting that the first superhero that turns such a huge profit on this is an immigrant, an illegal alien, somebody who is not necessarily a US citizen, basically stepped in from the outside, fixing these problems, and then retreating back into the anonymity of day-to-day life. And it's gratifying for a lot of readers to watch this type of character kind of go about fixing these problems and still maintaining this anonymity. And you can follow the character in the future and continue. So this prototype basically is where we started. I'm going to skip through some of this here, just so we can kind of think about how these images work. But it also looks very streamlined. It looks very modern. It's something that seems to be about the future. There's also lots of fun advertising in it, but mainly it's affordable. You can buy this. And you're bringing in other parts of the entertainment industry into the mix as well. Okay. I'm going to skip past this so that we have some time for some chatter here because I've been talking for an hour. Let me go back to my original question here. When you read a graphic novel or comic book, what makes that experience unique or different from reading an ordinary book? So I'm going to turn things over to Ryan to moderate a conversation for us now.
Okie doke.
And just kind of get feedback from you, or what you found interesting about this history. What elements did you see in the presentation today that you still see in contemporary comic books? Who has something to share?
Let's see here.
Yeah, Bristol, what do you think?
I'm sorry. So this is Shannon.
Oh, Shannon.
This was a little deep for Bristol. She's 11.
Okay.
But yeah, we like, I like comic books from going way back. I'm a little older, obviously, than she is. But we like the graphic novels to read together also, specifically because of the photos and the graphic nature of it. And she started looking at those way young. There was a Narwhal series, I don't remember what it was called, that she got into early, which is kind of like a gateway.
Yeah.
So that's what we really love. And I have very much enjoyed this whole thing. I've sat here the entire hour
Well,
just
thank you. Thank you.
So yeah, this is great. Going back to the ancient Greece, I mean, I just never would have thought of that, but I'm very much enjoying this.
Well, I've got questions for you about Shannon, about Bristol. Have you noticed, is there anything that she really just gravitates towards in terms of the individual panels? Is there something that you see, like she seems to really like this kind of artwork a lot?
I think the more colorful it is, you know, some of them are kind of grays and blacks and whites she's not as much into, and she's real into mystical, magical. So there are a few that we've picked up that she'll read them cover to cover. And some of them that we've gotten are thick like a book. They're not these little skinny 10 cents like what we remember, you know. But yeah, she likes them. She likes to read anyway, and we listen to a lot of audiobooks in the car and things. I homeschool, so we're in the car a lot. But this is definitely one of her favorite things to get into, is the graphic novel more than the comic book.
It's one thing that interests me about kids, especially in terms of reading comics, is when you are able to thumb through the pages of a comic, if there's a particular panel or a moment in the story that maybe scares you or makes you laugh really hard or something like that, as a kid, you can flip back a page and then look at the panels that lead up to that, and then see that and maybe flip past it real fast. But it gives you a certain control over that. It's like when you read a story to a kid and they say, "Can you read that part again?" And they want to kind of relive that part again, or you can see them getting nervous when you're getting close to a scary part. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, because she's very sensitive to evil. And you know, we got to the Harlot thing, she was like, yeah, that's too deep. I was like, all right, thank you.
Yeah. A little bit too much social reality there.
Yeah, I was like, I don't want to have to explain that. But
yeah.
Yeah, no, but that's very true. When it gets scary or really graphic, it kind of depends. It kind of depends on mood. Sometimes she's like what you said, like, hey, let's go back and redo this so I can see the whole thing again. Sometimes she just wants to, can we just skip this part? And so we'll just kind of scan the pictures.
Yeah, Mom, this part's boring. Let's get to the good stuff here.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's definitely a different experience than just reading words.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any thoughts or want to respond to Mark's question? Mark, I guess I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So now you can read comics online. I guess I'm curious, and I really like, have you used Hoopla to read comics? It's a library app, so you can actually scroll in. What's really nice about it, it's really interesting that you brought up, you know, some of the early like classical art, for instance, like on the Greek temple, right? Because it's an individual panel. So what's really interesting with the app Hoopla that you can use from, like, if a library has it, they have comics on Hoopla and you can read comics, is you can actually go in, and when you read a physical comic book or a graphic novel, you have all the panels on the page, right? So you're looking, you first kind of scan the page fully. Sometimes it's a full page, just one panel. Sometimes it's multiple panels telling the sequential narrative. But then you have to focus in on each direct panel. What's really cool about the app Hoopla that I really like, and it kind of takes me, it immediately, when you brought up some of the classical art, I immediately just started thinking about it, is you can scroll in and basically click panel by panel instead of just looking at the whole page. And then it allows you to see more of the detail. It's really incredible. So it's more of a comment than a question, but.
Well, it is a comment that brings up a question, and this is something I like to think about, especially when you think about why do people still buy the actual, staples and paper? Why do people actually still buy the book itself? And comic book readers that we have on our phones, the nice thing about that is on your phone, you just get immediate gratification all the time because you're scanning, you're skipping, you're moving, it's what we're used to doing anyway when we text. And so we're getting that visual information there. And something else I think is cool about the comic books on the phone is just like the Greek vase or like the Motopis on the Temple of Zeus, we get something that was made to fit within modern technology. So it's advancing the medium in a way to something that can be handheld or on a tablet or something like that, but where you just kind of can sit there and kind of enjoy the reading experience. And it's tactile too, because you're touching it while you're reading it. Now, the issue is here that makes reading comic books on the phone totally different, because Action Comics 1 is not a good example of this. But if you pick up any contemporary comic book, you get layout. You get a really interesting layout, and typically that layout is going to be very creatively done, where the insets of the images are maybe the bleeds, where the image goes all the way to the edge of the panel or something like that. That makes each page of the comic book much more artistic. So the layout itself becomes an artistic creation. And also when you flip the page, sometimes a really key moment of the plot is going to come up. For instance, a comic book that I like to read a lot, it's called The Punisher. And it's very gory, it's very violent, there's a lot of military battles in it. And sometimes when I turn the page, this is going to be really, really ugly. And so you get to turn the page, and sure enough, you get this full page spread of some really violent moment occurring. But I got to control it. I got to kind of touch the page and turn the page there. That's not necessarily something that's going to have the same impact on the phone either. So I love it that we can read comic books on the phone, but also I know this is taking the medium in two different directions now as well. Probably both very good too.
Yeah, any other questions?
I don't have so much a question, but sort of like a jumping off comment on that last bit about like online comics versus print comics. I've noticed I read a lot of comics on this site/app called Webtoons, where it's like rather than flipping through like a PDF page, it's like a continuous scroll. And I've noticed a lot of them, like kind of how you're mentioning, like the building of tension of a page turn. Instead of doing that, I've seen a lot of them where people will use blank space as kind of that similar medium. So you're still building that tension as you go on to the next panel. And I just thought that was really interesting as kind of a modern technique to create the same kind of atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for saying that, Sarah, too, because that's what I've always liked about the sequential part of this too. Your mind is working the whole time. And so whenever you realize that the medium is slowing things down and not giving the information that they know that you want, and maybe giving you that blank space, it's almost like yanking your chain a little bit, saying, I know you want to find out what's going to happen now. Aren't you enjoying the suspense? And that's just marvelous, I think, whenever you have things like that. I know a big group of people love the graphic novel Watchmen, but Watchmen was originally released as a series of comic books. And one key moment that occurs in Watchmen is basically when this complete apocalyptic destruction occurs. And just like you were describing, Sarah, everything goes white in the last pages of that. And everybody had to wait 1 month before the next issue came out. And then they could see, okay, what happened after the apocalypse? What occurred after that? Everything went white like that. Difference is when you read the graphic novel, you find out immediately, because you didn't have to wait a month.
Yeah, Mark, coming back to the importance of page layout, Jackie Crofts is a local cartoonist and graphic novel artist here in Indianapolis, and for the library's Comic-Con, she did a instructional video that we have on our YouTube page where she lays out basically how she looks at a script, a comic book script that's given to her, and basically lays out illustrates it, and she directly points out that, like, she wants your eye to follow the, kind of like an S shape or like a reversed S on the page through each panel. And so you do bring up a very good point that there is something kind of lost when we're looking at it on our phones or kind of scrolling into the exact panel, because you're not getting that sense of your eye, the movement of your eye necessarily over the whole page.
And what you just now said also touches on something I wanted to say during the lecture, and as usual, I over-prepared, so I didn't get to talk about this. During that period of time of experimentation with the publishing all throughout the 1930s, excuse me, that's when Will Eisner, the name of your event here, began doing his comics, and he worked in the pulps. He worked in all these areas as well. But like Rudolf Topfer, he understood how the brain works for reading comics. And he's published several books, just like your colleague. This is how people read comics, and this is how literacy works on the layout of this. So I'm pleased that you actually created an event that commemorates Will Eisner as somebody that basically says, here's kind of the science of this too.
Right. Yeah. And so we have just maybe a few more minutes. Is there any last questions for Mark before we sign off here? Don't want to take up all your afternoon, guys. All right. Well, Mark, it's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me too, and thank you all for attending. Keep reading your comics, and I just really appreciate that you showed up today to go through this history with me, and keep reading. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.